if the asteroid not even missed, but if it had hit in a different place, if it had hit at a different speed or angle, or any number of things have been slightly different, the extinction might have either been canceled or dramatically altered and dinosaurs would still be running around. It wasn't inevitable.
I'm Michael Tamblyn, CEO of Rakuten Kobo. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest today is science writer Riley Black, author of several bestsellers on paleontology, including My Beloved Brontosaurus, Written in Stone, and Skeleton Keys. And if you've read literally anything anywhere about dinosaurs in the last decade, you've probably happened upon pieces by her in National Geographic, Wired, Smithsonian Magazine, Scientific American, the all-star lineup of science writing. Her new book is The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, an asteroid, extinction, and the beginning of our world. It is a richly narrated story that starts with the end of the world. Riley Black, fellow mammal survivor, welcome to Kobo.
I like that intro. Thank you so much for having me on.
The Last Days of the Dinosaur is a highly kinetic book. It is a series of snapshots about the hours, days, and eventually the years and centuries following the impact of an asteroid that wiped out almost everything and opened a path for mammals to scurry up the ecological niches we now occupy. How do you pick the moments to drop the reader into in that chronology to look around a bit in our fossil record?
Oh, I love that you use that phrase, look around, because I thought about this in a very cinematic kind of way, where I thought about like movies that I love and where's the director kind of guiding your view. And it might be on part of a particular vista, it might be something very broad, and kind of thinking about like, where do I want to call attention to these things? And even 10 years ago, a book like this probably wouldn't have been possible. There were certain things that we knew about the impact that we could model from it, saying, about 66 million years ago, this impact occurred. About 100,000 years later, you have a whole bunch of ferns. A million years later, mammals are starting to do quite well. But a lot of that more granular, what happened in the second, the hour, the day, the week, the month, those are things that we've only really uncovered in the past maybe 5 years or so, some things even this year and last year that are entirely new to us. So I felt like as I was thinking about how do I want to approach the story, how do you approach the story of one of the worst days on the planet, the world's fifth mass extinction? And I had some of those benchmarks of okay, we have the moment of impact, we have a million years later, we have one or two things in between, but some of these new finds have okay, like I can really say something tangible about what was happening, that this isn't entirely just speculation, but I can actually draw from the fossil record, draw from the science, and try and put people there and take that different kind of approach. We have plenty of books about this extinction and how we came to understand it, but the story of how it transpired and how life recovered, that hadn't been done. So all those pieces really came together and inspired me to write this book.
And I want to come back to some of those discoveries a little bit later, because I'm really interested in what seems to be a period of very rich discovery that's going on in paleontology right now. But I want to start right at the beginning. As the curtain opens, we start with a Tyrannosaurus Rex, the biggest, the baddest dinosaur that most of us know. Why have them behind the opening curtain?
I knew I had to do something to grab readers, and really what better iconic animal to talk about but Tyrannosaurus Rex, because Tyrannosaurus Rex isn't just an emblem for dinosaurs in general, it's really the emblem for the last days of the dinosaurs, for that final moment. And I very specifically wanted to make our leading Tyrannosaur not fully grown. I wanted to make sure that she had some parasites. I even, using that pronoun, make it a female Tyrannosaur. I feel like so often we're used to seeing sort of the largest, the heaviest, the most ferocious, the sort of very almost like masculine T-Rex. He's in the prime of life. And I wanted to do something a little bit subversive with something familiar. And I felt like that was a good introduction. It's kind of like seeing a friend. It's like seeing somebody that you know. I don't want to compare it to this movie too much because it's really only a superficial resemblance. But I thought about it in terms of Psycho, and how the movie starts is very different from where it goes. And the cast of characters that you meet at the beginning is very different from the cast of characters that leads you through. So I felt like I needed to give the audience something to really ground themselves in space and time. And there was no better dinosaur to do that. I could have talked about any number of creatures. I could have talked about little crustaceans or mammals or birds or other things like that, but it just doesn't have the same weight to it. So it really had to be T-Rex.
We get a different character with each chapter. The Tyrannosaurus at the beginning, a big Edmontosaurus in the second chapter, and Ankylosaurus in the chapter during the impact and its immediate aftermath. And then things get very small. Can you introduce us to a couple of the survivors that we meet in the months and years after impact?
Yeah, the story really downsizes. It has to, in a sense, the effects of the impact itself. The immediate effects within the first day, the most primary factor in all this was that air temperatures rose to over 500 degrees Fahrenheit from basically all the impact debris coming back down to Earth. And there's nothing that can really survive that out on the surface, that you had to be small. You had to be small enough to get into a burrow or live underwater somehow. And most of the creatures that populate the rest of the book, the largest of them, I think there's a crocodile in one little vignette at some point that's around 20 feet long or so, but most of them are about the size of a pigeon to about the size of a German shepherd. And these are the survivors and their descendants moving through this. So they include things like tiny snakes, like itty bitty little snakes that would have been able to occupy burrows. That's much like today, even if those snakes aren't creating their own underground burrows, they probably use burrows created by other creatures, or even things like ferns and some of the plant life. It's very difficult to sort of write from the perspective of a fern, but I wanted to zoom in and talk about, how they're responding to the environment, what's changing for them, and how they are kind of this bellwether of life starting to recover. And at the end of each chapter, I try and zoom out to some other place on the planet. Most of the story takes place in what's now the Hell Creek Formation of Montana and the Dakotas, but this is a global event, and I really wanted to keep that scale. It's difficult knowing most of our information is from this one small pocket of the planet, but it's a global event. So one of my favorites was writing about this early little rodent, this little thing that resembles what today's like a mountain beaver, so this tailless, pudgy little roly-poly rodent that likely was very much like the first rodents somewhere in ancient Asia, this big turnover that's going on where some of the mammals that existed aren't doing so well. And there are new forms of mammals that are starting to evolve, including the ancestors of today's mice and rats and things like that. So things get really itty bitty, but I felt like they all had an important role to play in this, like that they're all there for a reason as a kind of indicator of a big change happening.
Well, and that scale gives a sense of just how small a target you had to be to make it through this momentous event. And one of the things that I love about the structure of the book is that it doesn't sit anywhere for very long, and even accelerates almost logarithmically through time after the asteroid impact. With more time and pages, would you have given us more stopping points along the way, or were those jumps kind of carefully considered, either because of science or because of just the amount of time that it was taking for evolution to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that I wanted to pick a kind of friendly time jump, kind of things that were more or less in the power of 10, because that's relatively familiar. I knew if I started throwing in sort of like, well, this particular formation is dated to, 66.07 million years, and this one's 65.82, like it starts to get, hard to track. But I didn't stay in any particular place too long because I felt like I wanted to keep things moving. I wanted to keep the story kinetic and follow through with some of these major categories. And I had originally thought about doing a little bit more. I thought about doing a kind of prologue that took place 75 million years ago, so about 9 million years before the impact. But then I thought, well, that's really cool, but it plays too much into this idea of whether dinosaurs were undergoing a decline or not. It didn't really help the story. I feel like there's certainly more to say, but this is like the narrative choice that writers often have to make. Like, do I try and put everything in and like sort of hold, I don't want to say accuracy, but sort of completeness up as the goal? Or is this a particular story that's being told and some things are just going to be left out of it just to kind of keep things moving along? So there's certainly lots of organisms I would have loved to have talked about, or different environments around the planet I would love to include. But this is, yeah, sort of the blockbuster version of the story.
As I said, we get dropped each chapter into the perspective of the lucky or the unlucky reptile or mammal or amphibian through which we're going to experience each new phase of the post-extinction world. Was it easy to choose, who would be the stand-in for each period of time, or for each jump in the fossil record?
At some points it was incredibly obvious. So like the last chapter before the conclusion, basically a million years after impact, that chapter is directly based on a fossil deposit in Colorado called Coral Bluffs that we've really only come to know in the past couple of years. And it has fossils from about 100,000 years after impact and also a million years after impact. And these are things like big turtles and caimans and mammals of all different sizes and shapes. And I really drew from some of those. There's a mammal called Eoconodon. That's one of the stars of the last chapter. And that's directly from those fossil deposits. And I liked them from the beginning. They're just this really neat kind of, they belong to a kind of group of mammals called Mesonychids. So carnivorous mammals, but had hooves instead of claws at the end of their feet. And I just was so charmed with them. I was like, okay, they have to be in this story. But there were some others that's like, I didn't know who I was going to pick for a particular time period. And I researched it, and it kind of emerged from different things I was reading. Like I knew I wanted to address acid rain and how that affected the fossil record, how it might have wiped out a lot of the fossil record that we might have otherwise found from the post-impact world. And that came from a paper about these little things called ostracods, these little crustaceans. You can still find them in habitats all over the world today. And I didn't expect to include them in the book at all, because who's ever heard of an ostracod to start with? And yet they were such an important indicator for the story that I knew I had to bring them into it. So there were some that's like, I knew absolutely like this organism has to be in the book, but other things just came out of the research, things that I didn't expect, things I learned in the process of writing this.
And that one that you just touched on was the head slapping moment for me in the first two chapters, because I had always had this question: if practically all of the dinosaurs died at once, why don't we have a layer of the fossil record that is absolutely full of dead dinosaurs and plants and everything else? Shouldn't we have a massive graveyard at the boundary that is marked by the asteroid impact and everything that died here? And you just, a second ago, glanced off the answer. So it would be great if you could expand on that a little bit more, because it solved a major mystery for me.
Like you said, you would think if there's this massive die-off that affects 75% of life on Earth, that we would have these sort of bone deposits. But the two reasons why not, and one is more practical and one is like a big picture answer about how the fossil record works. One of which was there's a lot of sulfur, basically rich compounds in the target rock, the rock that asteroid hit and pulverized and sent up into the air, a lot of sulfates. And that's really good, not only at reflecting sunlight and cooling things down, is what led to the impact winter for about 3 years after impact, but also when those basically compounds come back down in the form of rain and create acid rain. And it's not enough to singe anybody's skin or anything like that. But over time, if there's anything that's exposed, and keep in mind that these are bones that have already been through a lot. They're from organisms that died during this heat pulse. There are global forest fires, not as in consuming the whole planet, but just all over the place. You already have these damaged bones that are being affected by acid rain, basically eroded away. The other aspect is just the way the fossil record is, in that, we've known this since the 19th century, that if you think of it as a book, it's not a complete book. It's a book where you only have a certain percentage of the pages. And on those pages, you only have a certain number of paragraphs and sentences and words. So you're looking at all these little tidbits, trying to piece together this bigger story, because it's only a small fraction of what existed that came preserved. And this has something to do with a really technical concept. But if you want to look up, it's called the Signor ellipse effect. So basically, if you imagine just look at a wall in your office or your home. If you took a handful of little plastic dinosaurs and you threw it against that wall, they're not all going to line up right against that boundary. If you treat that as like an extinction boundary, they're going to pop up in different places. And the fossil record is very much like that, in that organisms sometimes survive, but we don't have their fossil record, or sometimes they go extinct earlier, but we don't know exactly when that is. It's very similar with this boundary, where it's like that boundary, it's like drawing a line across the fossil record, but what's going to show up, there may or may not have been great preservation potential for that to actually make it in later. We have a
Mhm.
few sites. A lot's been made about this site, Tanis in North Dakota. What's going to come out of that? We'll have to wait for a lot of the papers. But they have really great fish. I can say that much. We know that so far. But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we're probably not going to find like sort of like those old animations of like the secret elephant graveyard. There's not going to be equivalent
Mhm.
of that for the non-avian dinosaurs. The fossil record is a pretty harsh thing. It's pretty rare and unique to become a fossil.
Your description of the impact shows the struggle that we have in talking about truly planetary scale events. You talk about explosion equivalent to 100 teratons of dynamite, 420 zettajoules worth of energy. Can you talk a bit about the scope and scale of that impact and why it was truly a kind of a planetary extinction event?
The way that I thought about it's like these are children's numbers. These are numbers that are so big that you might as well like ask your average, dinosaur loving 7-year old. And they're gonna say it's like a million zillion.
Yeah,
It's like,
they
yeah,
sound like
yeah.
bajillions. Yes.
Yes, yes. It's incomprehensible, really, how big this was, and it makes sense when you think about that. You're dealing with a 7-mile wide chunk of rock. It's been around basically since the formation of our solar system. It just didn't get taken up into anything, and that this is being basically shot by gravity towards our planet at hundreds of thousands of miles an hour, and our planet is moving at tens of thousands, hundreds of thousand miles an hour, and also orbiting and turning. And as we know, from anytime two moving objects hit each other, all that energy behind their movement sort of combines and creates something even greater. And this was a matter of, the asteroid also struck at a low angle, and it struck just the worst kind of rocks. That this really was like the worst case possible scenario that there was, because there have been other impacts through time. We actually have larger impact craters from even the past 66 million years. One in Siberia called the Papagai crater that's even bigger than the Chicxulub crater in the Yucatan, tied to the Cretaceous extinction. Only the Papagai crater, it's not tied to a mass extinction. So it wasn't even just
Hmm.
like the speed and the power and the amount of energy released, but that this asteroid struck basically the remnants of ancient reefs. And it struck so hard and at such an angle that it really had the worst possible consequences in throwing debris back out into the atmosphere. And then the chemical components of that limestone affecting the global climate, to the point where there are massive volcanic eruptions happening at the same time, so much so that we thought that they might have been an extinction trigger. Turns out
Hmm.
that those volcanic eruptions actually saved some of life on Earth. They basically created so much global warming that it counteracted some of the impact winter. So this is a kind of like global processes that we're talking about, that you have to kind of zoom out a little bit. And that was a challenge to write about, because so much of this is organic, so much of it is on the ground. But I knew I had to not villainize the asteroid, but at least take a moment to say, okay, like, how did it get here? What was it doing? It wasn't like it was just like hanging out near our orbit and then just dropped in. That basically it was on the way for the entire rise and evolution of the dinosaurs. So basically, like the one with their name on it was approaching during their entire heyday, and just that blew my mind.
When we zoom down into the details of individual chapters, there's some things that really jump out. There is a lot about eating in this
Yes.
book, not of the of kind of the version that I'm used to from the books that I was reading, as a kid into dinosaurs, of animals tearing each other's throats apart, but passages about chewing and teeth, plants, nutrition, energy budgets, different animals' rates of burning energy, even poop comes up. So why is it so important to make sure that the reader could see the world through that lens of what animals can eat, what they can find?
Some of that's personal, in terms of like that's what I think about when I go out for a hike or I see organisms. Like how do you live here? How are you interacting with the ecosystem around you? And I feel like that's very important when we talk about dinosaurs, because so often when we think about dinosaurs, they're almost singular. It's almost like action figures where, we want to know everything about
Hmm.
that dinosaur, but then how does it interact with its environment? So if we think of something like an apatosaurus, one of these long necked dinosaurs, um, how much plant material does it have to eat in a particular day? Are some plants more nutritious than others? When you're, 60 feet long and weigh upwards of 30 tons, that's a lot of animal to feed. And if we can understand some of that, we can understand some of their evolution. For example, that these dinosaurs, they didn't chew. They basically just horfed everything down and let it process inside themselves because they had to do that to get enough nutrition. It was this weird little trade-off where if you're spending a lot of time chewing, then you're actually getting less than if you were just sucking down all the ferns and horsetails you could possibly find. So I initially went to college as an ecologist, and I often bring that view to my writing, that I don't want to just kind of do the biography of the animal itself, but pull out some of these threads and connections that really let us understand how much the world changes. One of the most important ones to me was once the non-avian dinosaurs disappear in the book and you have all these forests coming back, that the forest can grow a lot denser. They can grow a lot more closely together because there aren't big herbivores pushing over trees and pushing, basically stomping down pathways through the forest and knocking stuff over. So it created this crucible for mammals that never existed before. You used to have these very open spaces where dinosaurs could roam. All of a sudden, you can have a forest that basically grows shoulder to shoulder. And that creates a very different kind of environment. So I felt like it would have been too jarring to kind of focus too much on sort of, here's T-Rex and it's doing its mighty thing, and here's Triceratops, now it's gone. But to really talk about how fundamentally, their processes, like what they did and all those little ecosystem interactions, like you mentioned dung. Like what did the dung beetles do when non-avian dinosaurs were not supplying them with food anymore? How did they make the jump? So I really love those smaller stories, being able to connect some of those threads.
And it was the first book in paleontology that I'd really seen like kind of food webs, the things that you'd find in kind of a more classical ecological study show up, and which becomes especially relevant when you look at the collapse of those webs, the loss of so many different species all at once, and then watching those get pieced back together by the animals that remain.
Absolutely. That's this idea of contingency, right? Is that evolution, there aren't infinite possibilities at any given moment. There's certain pathways that open and close. And if we're talking about on the ecological scale, it's often determined by who survives and what they do and what kind of physiology they have. It's kind of mind-blowing that, we often think of dinosaurs as so superior. We think of them as being, very active and dynamic and hot-blooded and stuff, which is all accurate, which is all great. But so many of the survivors were ectotherms. They were cold-blooded animals because when you're cold-blooded, you can get by on less. And that says something about why we didn't get a second age of reptiles and why mammals were able to take off, whereas previously, 200 or so million years before that point, it was proto-mammals that were running the show, and it was reptiles who were in the backseat. So some of these big shifts, they really have to be told, I guess, in the context of these, okay, what's our starting condition? If we more or less cleared the field and we're left with a small group, 25% of what once existed, and that's still there and that's still hanging on, how is that going to change the shape of life on Earth? And that comes with that idea of if the asteroid not even missed, but if it had hit in a different place, if it had hit at a different speed or angle, or any number of things have been slightly different, the extinction might have either been canceled or dramatically altered. Non-avian dinosaurs would still be running around. So it was really this critical, it wasn't inevitable, really. It was a matter of you have diversity creating more biodiversity. And then when you cut so much of that back, you get to restart that process and see it run again.
You could almost classify this as a book of speculative fiction, if a book of speculative fiction that kept all of its receipts,
yes,
to back it up. But in many ways, I was wondering about the relationship between you writing this and paleoart, that process of trying to figure out what a dinosaur looked like based on what's come through on the fossil record. Was that engagement with previous depictions or previous sources, the images that you'd seen before, or the ones that you see when you look at a fossil and close your eyes? Is that something that animated this work?
Oh, certainly. I mean, from the time I was very small, I loved seeing Paleoart, and I love seeing it change. How much depictions of these animals like were modified over time, and not just the familiar ones, but also some of the relatively obscure ones. It makes me think, for example, obviously we have a new Jurassic World movie that's out now, and it's got some new dinosaurs in it, and one of them is Pyroraptor, which is a really awesome name. It is an awesome name for all of about 6 bones that are very, very small, and we don't really know a whole lot about this animal, and yet there it is on the silver screen, covered in feathers, bigger than a human, swimming underwater, making paleontologists head desk, across the land. And yet, like, I love the fact that, if we're to talk about accuracy at all, it's like, okay, obviously the Hollywood interpretation goes a little bit too far. But when we think about these animals, we have to use our imaginations, that we need some amount of speculation, and that there's certain things that we know about organisms in general that also would have applied to dinosaurs. The example that I use in sort of the appendix of the book, which is the receipts that you just mentioned, is there's this book from the 19th century called The World Before the Deluge, and in it there's this woodcut illustration of an Archaeopteryx, this early bird, flying over a Jurassic forest. And the Archaeopteryx is covered in feathers and it's meant to be a life restoration, but it has no head. It's this headless, like, squab kind of like flying over the forest. And that's because at the time, nobody knew what the head of Archaeopteryx looks like. They'd found it, they confused it for fish jaws or something on the same slab. And that's kind of ridiculous because we know it was a bird. We know it was a vertebrate. We know it had a skull and jaws and, had a central nervous system and all that stuff. So it's not more accurate to just leave it off. We are always dealing with this question of like, okay, what do we know? What's the next step we can take from that? But we still have all those things, all the muscles and organs and nerves and behaviors and interactions that we might not have a direct idea about, but we know that they must have been there. We know that it must have happened, so we can make an informed guess as a result. So you're entirely right that, like, I was really expecting people to respond to this book and call it, speculative fiction a lot more, say this isn't really science writing, it's something else. But I think, especially in paleontology, like, we need it. We need speculation. We need imagination, because otherwise then you're just going to have reams of data about this or that flange on a particular bone. And it doesn't really get us any closer to understanding these animals. So it's like not being afraid of being wrong, saying this is like when I think about the past, when I think about this dinosaur, this is what I see. And somebody else might have a different perspective. And then we have an argument or a conversation about it. And then science keeps going.
In all of the different stories and episodes and vignettes that you capture in this book, is there one that really resonated with you, or that you really wanted to make sure that you got right?
I think the conclusion, I think the ending, because it still blows my mind to this day that primates were present for this mass extinction. And by that, I mean that the earliest primate that we know about, this little animal called Purgatorius, it looked like a modern day tree shrew, like, so a little insectivore thing with a bushy tail, kind of like if you took a squirrel and you just kind of like pulled them a little bit. That's what it looked like. And it evolved and was around at the same time as Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops. And they survived the mass extinction. We find them in rocks millions of years after impact. And when we talk about this event, the last mass extinction before the one that we're presently in, it's often in terms of like its importance to us, that if it hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here, which is, I think, is certainly true. But even if it played out slightly differently, or if conditions hadn't been just right, our ancestors, our earliest primate ancestors, would have gone extinct and we wouldn't be here anyway. And I think that's amazing that, it was really important to this idea of resilience, because so often when we talk about dinosaurs, we talk about extinction, we're focused on the losses, like how devastating, how catastrophic it was. What really struck me, what drove so much of the book, was this idea of how does life come back? How does it thrive sort of in the face of adversity? How did those little straggling survivors make it through, including our own ancestors? And I felt like just connecting directly to the reader, but also just instilling that sense of hope and resilience in the end of it. Like, I really wanted to get that aspect of the story right and create that personal connection. Say, this isn't just an academic exercise in replaying a mass extinction. This is something that, like, our great, et cetera, aunts and uncles were present for, and is directly relevant to why we're here.
Let's roll back in your record a little bit. Tell me about starting out as a science writer. What were the first projects that you did that started to build into the momentum of a career in that space?
Yeah, I think fascination when I was very young was part of it. I am told that when I was young, I very quickly went through. Um, Basically, I liked trucks for a hot minute, and that was elephants, which I still very much care about. And then dinosaurs are next. So, like, big and loud, I guess, seem to be
Yes.
the thing. And I remember going to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City around 1988. And this was before their big renovation of those fossil halls that you can still see them
Hmm.
now. Back then, they were dark and they're really moody, and you could really get this sense of like almost like dinosaur ghosts. Like you could really sort of relate to these skeletons. And that really struck with me. And I always kept that fascination. And through school and everything else, I had a knack for writing. Never finished anything, but I tried to like start writing my own novels. I would write little stories. I developed that. I just found a lot of joy in writing and taking what I learned and trying to turn it into something different. And when I wanted to become a science writer, it was really because I was a frustrated student. At my university, I wasn't doing super well in my program. I also couldn't get out of it because I was too many credits along. But I used that wonderful university access to read all the books and papers that I was always curious about and just could never get at before. I didn't want to read sort of the, popular press interpretation of these fossils. I wanted to read that paper and learn about it and see like, oh, this dinosaur, like we only know half of its skeleton, so who knows what the skull looks like? And that's very, very different from what was being presented in the popular press. And writing about it helped me remember. So very quickly that went from blogging to writing for Smithsonian to coming out with my first book. And it was really all really just pure curiosity, just pure like, how do we know what we know and how do we construct this form of knowledge? It was really learning about the process of science through paleontology. And that's really the thread of reading any of my books, even though I've done a whole bunch, that's really at the center of each of them. They might have different topic areas, but it's really about this conversation that we're always having with nature.
And where was the tipping point where you knew, oh, this, I'm going to get to do this as a job. This is actually for real.
I think it was around the time that my first book came out. So I've been blogging for Smithsonian. They had a blog called Dinosaur Tracking that I wrote for, 5 times a week for a number of years. And I was doing that at the same time as my first book, Written in Stone, was coming out. And Written in Stone was published by Bellevue Literary Press. I'm so glad that they took a chance on me. But basically nobody else wanted this book because I wasn't an authority on anything. I was just this 26-year-old student who had a passion for fossils. And I had the story to tell, and I really wanted to tell it. So Bellevue said, okay, here's $1,000 honorarium, which is about as much as I needed to buy the laptop I required to write the book.
Right.
I basically did it for free. I was just so driven to do it. And to see people in the field I admire say that they liked the book and to see it pretty much universally get positive reviews and people started paying attention. And then my following book, My Beloved Brontosaurus, I think that was the moment where I met with my editor for that book, Amanda Moon, in a science writing conference. And normally when you pitch a book, you need to pitch it to a whole bunch of publishers and they might say yes or no or can change it or whatever.
Hmm.
And she wanted whatever I was doing next. And that to me is like, okay, I think this is something that I can actually do and support myself and my family with. And really that was about 11 years ago and I've just been running with it ever since.
And being a 5 day a week science blogger feels like the most punishing science writing schedule that exists out there. So how how was it to just shift gears from I have to have something to talk about every week to I'm building these much bigger narratives and much bigger stories in book form?
Honestly, I miss science blogs to some degree. It makes me sad that they've largely gone extinct. Some of it
Hmm.
was that science blogs only got big as the rest of basically the public was already moving to Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that. Scientists, we tend to come to like whatever the trendy thing is kind of late. But I'm glad that it existed because I felt like there was a lot of room to make things personal. What is my view or perspective on this, or have a discussion, or even just talk about like here's the silly kind of thing. Like when I wrote Dinosaur Tracking, a lot of it wasn't just about like scientific studies. I wrote a lot about just neat things from the history of paleontology, or there's a neat new dinosaur movie or theme park or something like that opening up, and how does that compare to what we've seen before? And especially in paleontology, especially with dinosaurs, pop culture and science, they're not only side by side, they're often so intertwined in so many ways. So there was always something to talk about. So even though I love being able to write books and feature articles and kind of pick what I'm talking about, I also miss that freedom, partially because right now, like a science story, let's say I see something in a scientific journal that's coming out next week, and I think it's really cool. And I'll take that to an editor and say, I think this is really neat. I'd love to write about it. They might say yes, but half the time or so they say no. And it might be a really neat study. And they might just say, well, it seems incremental, or it's not going to be exciting for the public, or whatever the reasoning is. But that doesn't mean that that study or that idea isn't with merit. And I felt like with blogs, there's always room for it, that you kind of had support to do it. And now we've gone back to a form of science communication that honestly, despite the internet, it seems like it's more like it was in the 80s and 90s, where it's much more journalism focused. It's much more focused on articles and books and sort of what goes on in terms of social media and video and YouTube and TikTok and everything else is almost like a separate universe. It's much less cohesive than it was maybe 10 or 11 years ago. So yeah, I think even though it was a difficult schedule, and I think bloggers should have been paid more than they actually were, it was still great to have a kind of informal platform to make it personal. I'm glad I had that opportunity, because otherwise I don't know if I would have become a writer. That avenue might not have otherwise been open to me.
I described you in the intro as a science writer, but you also do field work
That's right.
most summers.
Mm-hmm.
And for someone who has made their living for years talking about dinosaurs, you still describe yourself as an amateur paleontologist.
Yes.
So I'm wondering what distinction are you making there, and what does it mean to you to keep that amateur status?
Yeah.
Assuming that you're not just holding out to represent, the U.S. in the paleontological Olympics.
I think, as time has gone on, I've come more and more towards the feeling that, I can just call myself a paleontologist. I think I've published papers, I speak at museums, I've written books, I'm in the acknowledgements of papers for contributing discussions to ideas in the technical literature. It's something where I think for a long time, especially coming from a non-professional background, and I didn't finish my degree. I didn't, go to graduate school to study with any in particular. That science is often very formalized, and it's often very important that if you earn that doctorate or you earn that master's, that's certainly part of your identity, and respect should be paid as well as should to that. But paleontology is wonderful in that there's so many different ways to be a paleontologist. So when I would say amateur, is mostly like I'm not paid in any sort of, I don't have a professional position. I'm not a professor anywhere. I'm not a curator anywhere. Every day, I'm basically trying to figure out, what do I want to say? What do I want to write about today? And I could stop tomorrow and no one would probably really notice. But as time has gone on, and certainly found more confidence in myself, it's like, no, I am a paleontologist. I've made important discoveries. I have contributed to the field, I think, in an important way. And this is something, like you just said, like I've been involved in daily for the past 11 years of my entire professional career. It has been based around fossils and trying to understand them. So yeah, I think moving forward, I'm going to drop the amateur and just go with paleontologist.
I grew up in the 70s and 80s. And back then, a paleontologist, or basically anybody working in the field, was, kind of a rugged-looking, dusty guy, kind of Sam Neill in Jurassic Park, possibly with a scruffy beard like a paleontologist Robert Becker. And it seemed to me like a very straight white guy kind of business.
Yeah.
I talked with Steve Brissate on the show last year, and he expressed optimism that the field is changing.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to check in with you. Do you agree? Does it seem like things are changing, or are they changing but at a geological pace?
I think they're changing, but it is at a geological pace. I think a large problem is not even so much the diversity of people who want to be involved in paleontology, because I think the diversity is there, especially amongst students and volunteers and early career researchers and avocational paleontologists. There are all kinds of people from all kinds of different walks of life. There's racial diversity, there's able diversity, there's diversity in terms of sex and gender and everything. But the main problem that we have, and this is really systemic, it's something that has to do with like the way academia is run and who gets rewarded for what and the number of positions that are open. It's that we have this diversity, and yet a lot of folks who are in what we consider like desirable. I don't even want to say top tier, but people who are like curators and professors and the sorts of people that you're likely to see on television. Most of the time, it is the same kind of person. And that's not to say that they don't do good work or anything else, but the barriers that exist, the fact that it is so much harder for people from sort of backgrounds that are different from those of someone like a Jack Horner or Bob Bacher. That's the part that we still struggle with, really. And I think there's a greater awareness that's coming up, and I think it's part of generational turnover, because a lot of folks that the same people that we saw in the 80s and 90s on shows, that they're still holding down some of the same positions. They're still in these same sort of slots. And as things change, I think we're going to really see the field open up. And I think it's important. It's not just about numbers or sort of, being able to see somebody like you in the field, which is very important. But, we know that we're trying to understand an objective reality from our own subjective standpoints, that who we are, where we grew up, the sort of financial circumstances of where we are, all these things you might not think it matters very much to dinosaurs or to nature. But there's so many historical examples of misunderstanding a certain aspect of biology because the person doing that study came from a particular background or just didn't consider a different point of view. Things like the great alpha wolf myth that mostly came up in the wake of World War II, when researchers were looking at wolves as like generals and their soldiers and didn't really think about other social dynamics that were in play that somebody else might have been able to see. So, and this is why it's important to have these perspectives. So, because when we write a paper, we're talking about science, like from where I stand, this is what I'm seeing. But somebody else with a different perspective might not see the same thing or see a different wrinkle to it. And that's all part of that process, that this isn't like dictating nature to everybody, but it's a conversation both with nature and amongst ourselves. So I think things are changing, and it's important that they are changing. I would be really excited to see, I think, what's going to come in the next 10 years or so in the field. I think the shakeup is just about ready, but we're waiting for those opportunities to open up to really let people just vibrantly do what they do and see what comes from it.
As a part of that shakeup, this is your first book by a major publisher under your name, Riley Black. And among the many coming out events that a queer person can go through,
yes,
how do you rank this one? Is this a big deal, or is this a non-event?
It's a big deal for me because it's good to see my name on a book that I felt passionate about. I had a couple of books that were work for hire. One was a children's book, and one was like a coffee table book, whereas more like, Riley, we know you're an expert on this. We just need you to write something about this topic. It's like, okay, I can do that. I could use the $8,000 today. But this is the one that like I believed in, that was really, it's something personal. And I talk about a bit in the conclusion that, that my perspective as a transgender woman, like really has a lot to do with why I was attracted to this story of sort of catastrophe and then resilience. It has a lot to do with what I was going through in my own life at the time, that I basically very suddenly found myself going through the middle of divorce and transitioning at the same time. And it felt like the world that I knew had pretty much vanished, much the way that at the end of the Cretaceous, everything was fine on a particular day. And the next day, life was fundamentally different. And I really related to that story. So this became a very important and personal book in that respect. It's not something that I necessarily expect to weave through all of my writing, because I think sometimes, especially for queer authors, there's always a kind of danger of, always putting that gloss over it. And we're not allowed to just like, yeah, that's part of who I am, but like, it doesn't need to be at the forefront of every single thing, or like that sense, like you mentioned, of constantly coming out and sort of framing it in such a way. But this was a special book to me. It felt very personal. And I feel like if readers can get to that conclusion and understand that connection with it, it kind of puts the rest of the book in a very different light, and they can either take that with them or they can stick with the science part. But I felt like it was really essential to say, like, part of the reason that I know I've been fascinated with this story is learning about how, to borrow Ian Malcolm's line, that life finds a way, like that if something is alive.
I just wanted to be clear that you brought Jeff Goldblum into this, not me. Okay.
I mean, it's hard not to with these things, right?
He had all the best lines. That's why. In the world of writers and researchers, names matter a lot.
Mhm.
Your professional career is tied to your list of publications, your bibliography, or the link on the author page. When you've decided that it's time to leave an old identity behind, how do you navigate that as a part of your career, as in respect of the work that's been done
Mhm.
before? What does that process feel like for you?
It felt really vulnerable, and I wasn't entirely sure how to handle it. I'm not sure that I would have done anything differently, but to put this in perspective, I hadn't even started work on the last days of the dinosaurs yet when I came out. And when my marriage ended, I actually was just about to publish the previous book, Skeleton Keys, which I had seen the cover art for. Everything had been put together. And it felt very strange to have a book that was about to hit shelves, but it didn't have my name on it. But I knew that in trying to talk to interviewers or people who want to talk about the book about this, it didn't feel safe to do so. In fact, I kind of ran into that with the Wall Street Journal, and that they wanted me to write a sort of promotional article tied to the book, which I did. And I said, like, could we do this under Riley Black? That's my real name. I'm transitioning. That's what I'd like to do. And their response is like, well, we don't want to do that because that's going to confuse the readers, because I just had a new book out with a different name on it. My wish
Mm.
would have been to go and basically disappear for maybe about 2 or 3 years and do something else and kind of reintroduce myself at some other point. But that also would have been cutting myself off from the various things I had done and contributed to. So I really felt like,
Hmm.
since I was already like a very minor public figure, but a public figure nonetheless, there wasn't really any choice other than basically to do it live, to do it, out in the open and sort of take control of the narrative and the story myself and not turn it into a sort of vulnerable moment where someone might later say, aha, I figured it out, and all those sorts of things, to just be open about the experience. And that really saw me through the whole thing. I think once I made that decision, it took a lot of that fear and uncertainty away. And now it's like I don't reference my older book as much as I used to. I'd love to go back and rewrite some of them. Some of them, like My Beloved Brontosaurus, can certainly use an update. And I think it would be certainly fun to do that. And I have some readers who are like, is it possible I can get your old books under your real name? It's like, unfortunately, that doesn't look like it's going to happen. But yeah, it's kind of, each book that I've written represents a different time in my life and a different time in my career. Skeleton Keys, oddly enough, all about our human skeletons, was kind of closing the book on what life used to be. And Last Days of the Dinosaurs is sort of a tribute to that, but also the life that's coming after. So even though I didn't write it for this reason, I think it would be really easy to look at my body of work and see that shift. And I've noticed people have mentioned as well that the new book seems much more joyful. It seems much more passionate, whereas some of my previous books seem to have a sense of like sadness or difficulty with them, which that's what dysphoria does to your brain. It makes it very difficult to do some things. So I'm really looking forward to what comes after this. And I'm thinking about writing about fossil plants next, the book on paleobotany. And I think that really fits in with that theme of growth and sort of how vibrant life can be.
So you'll get your own version of the KPG boundary between those two books that you can look back on and see where everything changed.
Yeah, I should maybe organize them like that on my bookshelf. Just have a little like slice of clay or something like that to separate.
There's an irradiated gap.
Yes, I like it. I like
Excellent.
it.
I wanted to come back to something that we touched on earlier, which was you mentioned that there are some discoveries that have really only happened in the last 5 years that illuminated different parts of this book. And I was wondering if you could touch on a couple of those. Like, what are things that really are fresh science that have made it onto these pages for the first time?
The most recognizable one, mostly because it's been mostly the most out in the press, really, is the Tana site in the Dakotas. There's a lot of controversy about the site, the particular paleontologist who's running that dig. But the initial paper, which is basically a geology paper about, okay, we have the impact that occurs in the ancient Yucatan. How quickly did sort of seismic activity, earthquakes, reach the ancient Hell Creek ecosystem, and what effects did those have, causing, sort of this idea of a Seiche wave. So if you have this basin that's filled with water, that's almost like a bathtub during an earthquake. It kind of sloshes back and forth and then spills out over the landscape and created this fossil site. And I felt, as controversial as that site can be, that paper had enough solid science behind it to really bring that into the story. And that's something that really only showed up about 2 years ago in the popular press. There's been another paper since about the fish, and that this impact likely occurred in the springtime based upon sort of what the growth rates of those fish were doing versus having like the impact spherules, the glass in their gills. So we're still learning a lot about this particular area. But the other one that I was really most excited about, and I think deserves a lot more attention, is Corral Bluffs in Colorado. And that documents 100,000 years and 1,000,000 years after impact. And you can see mammals becoming larger, but in a particular way. Like a recent study found that like their body size got bigger, but their brains didn't. So you have something that, their lineage went from being the size of a house cat to being the size of a German Shepherd, but having the same size brain. And what does that mean for their behavior and how they're interacting with their environment? And that body size kind of came first in this habitat, in an environment where we get things like the first legumes, the first like ancestors of beans, these like protein-rich plants that probably underwrote the evolution of these mammals. And even analyses, there are always fossil analyses going on that are wonderful. It's not always something that you just find in the rock, right? And that you bring back to a museum and you go, aha, we've learned something new. But analyzing like things like sediment cores or modeling ancient climates. So things like there was a paper in PNAS, or the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that looked at the Deccan traps, these eruptions that were thought to be an extinction trigger in the past. And it turns out they actually warmed the climate during a time where it might have otherwise been very cold, and made the extinction less severe than it would have been. So a lot of this showed up right on time. It's kind of terrifying as a writer, because you're wondering, okay, there's a 9-month period between when I'm going to finish this and when it appears. I hope that there's nothing that's going to contradict the critical parts of my story. You have to kind of predict, in a sense, like what are the safe bets and where are you going further out on a limb. But it's a really exciting time for paleontology. And what I would really love to see is if we can find some more of these fossil sites around the world. What makes Montana and the Dakota so interesting for this time period is you have rocks through the end of the Cretaceous and the first parts of the following time period, the Paleocene. Is the before and after snapshots of this disaster. Those are very hard to find around the rest of the planet, but they are there. There have been a few reports of them so far. And that's what's going to be really interesting, seeing how, a place in Europe or Australia or Asia really compares to what's going on in ancient North America. And if this extinction, more or less played out the same just about everywhere, or if it was quite different in different places. So this book, I feel like, is the most accurate for what I can do right now, but who knows, if I'm lucky enough to see, 20, 30, whatever years from now, I might be saying like, oh yeah, I had no idea what I was talking about. We know very much differently now.
No. That's called second edition.
Yes.
That's what that is. I can't help looking at the parallels between this great extinction that you document at the border of the Paleocene and our own self-made extinctions in the Anthropocene. Does thinking about people as a force of extinction hang in the background for you while you write about extinctions caused by an asteroid 66 million years ago?
It certainly did, because I've gotten a few comments, from people who've read the book who come away with maybe a little different message about life and how it responds to disaster. And it certainly was very much on my mind in terms of, am I being somewhat irresponsible in suggesting that life is resilient? Because we are certainly living in a time of increased extinction, and that our oceans may very well collapse if we don't do anything in on a century scale. So we're talking like great grandchildren kind of time scale, that they're going to be affected by what we're doing now. And I didn't want to have too rosy of a view. It was kind of difficult to balance between life is incredibly, or can be incredibly fragile, but it's also wonderfully resilient. The fact that life appeared on Earth, originated over 3.5 billion years ago, and it's never entirely been wiped out. And that's an amazing thing. But 99% of all species have gone extinct, and species are going extinct even now as we speak. So it was a matter of, I wanted to give people hope in the sense that, life can respond to these changes, life can adapt and thrive again, but maybe trying to work in there a little bit, like, if we can, we should avoid pushing it to the brink. That, I really wanted to drive home, that's an ecological view, really, that this isn't just about the loss of individual species. Is the way, like, I feel like it was presented to me, like, often through elementary school, was sort of, we talk about these lists, like, these are all the different animals that have gone extinct, but we didn't talk about sort of the ghosts they leave behind in their habitats, in terms of, the plants that now don't get eaten, don't get their seeds dispersed, or a kind of prey species that now becomes super abundant because the predator is no longer there. So it was kind of trying to weave that in through that ecological view, that sort of thing, that there's no one correct side to it, but looking at it in terms of connections, like that we are severing all these sorts of connections and new ones can spring up, but we should be careful about what it is that we're doing.
Last question for me. Twitter told me that you dusted off a novel draft.
Yes.
That might get some more work put into it this summer. Can you tell me anything about that?
Yeah, it's something that I started writing, I think in 2018. I can't quite remember. It's one of those projects where you have the initial idea and you jot it down. You're super excited about it. It's like, and I don't know what to do with it. But I really grew up, it was the age of, prior to Jurassic Park, the dinosaur movies and media that existed were things like, super old reruns or adaptations of, Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World on TV and in film, or a lot of Ray Harryhausen kind of stop motion dinosaur movies, or things like 1 Million Years BC, or When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. And I really love those Lost World kinds of stories. And I really loved, like, with things like King Kong, like Skull Island, this idea that there's this island somewhere that has organisms, like, left over from the Mesozoic. But, like, as in the Peter Jackson adaptation, maybe they've been evolving since then. Maybe they're different. So the novel idea is really the Bone Wars set on a place like Skull Island, basically this competition between paleontologists to discover and describe and really delve into this little pocket of animals that were thought to be extinct in a place where they've been evolving for the 66 million years hence. So there won't be familiar dinosaurs in it, like a T-Rex or a Triceratops, but there'll be descendant animals. One of the ones I'm really proud of is a ceratosaur relative. So one of these predatory dinosaurs that had bones or osteoderms in their body, and imagining, well, what if it were a quadruped? Because we don't have a quadrupedal carnivorous dinosaurs. And what if those osteoderms got big enough to look like boulders and kind of act as camouflage? And you have this ambush predator that's doing something very different. So that's the general idea. Is, it's based on, our protagonist is based on a real life paleontologist named Annie Montague Alexander, who was really important in the founding of the Paleontology Program and Museum at University of California, Berkeley. So it's like, what if she were to visit a place like Skull Island in the late 19th century, populated by all these prehistoric leftovers, and the sort of paleo pulp adventure that comes from that. So it's kind of my tribute to the media that really inspired me when I was little.
Cannot wait. Riley, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
I have been speaking with science writer Riley Black, author of the new book, The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, An Asteroid, Extinction, and the Beginning of Our World. Find links to it and all the books we've talked about at kobo.com/conversation. Check the show notes for a link. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamlin. Thank you for listening.